Late autumn settled heavily over southern Missouri in October of 1987. The Ozark backcountry had already begun to empty out for the season. Campgrounds closed early. Gravel service roads disappeared beneath fallen leaves. What remained was quiet, thick, rural silence broken only by hunters and the occasional freight truck cutting through state highways miles away. It was in that quiet that a local bow hunter walked off a marked trail, following fresh deer sign deeper into the timber. He wasn't looking for anything unusual, but near an abandoned forest access road, one that hadn't been maintained in years, he saw something that stopped him cold. A pair of boots, upright, clean, placed unnaturally on the dirt. Then the body attached to them. The man was later identified as Raymond Ray Keller. He was 34 years old, a long-haul freight escort by trade, someone whose job was to ride along with high-value shipments, making sure they arrived where they were supposed to. Ray had been shot twice in the chest and once in the head. The shots were precise, close range, controlled. There was no wallet on him, no weapon, no defensive wounds, no signs that he had run. The hunter backed away slowly and drove nearly 20 miles before finding a payphone to call it in. When deputies arrived, the first assessment was simple and familiar: a robbery gone bad. The Ozarks had a reputation, fair or not, for isolated crimes that never fully made sense: illegal dumping sites, bootleggers who still ran back roads at night, occasional violence that drifted in from somewhere else and disappeared just as quickly. Ray Keller's death seemed to fit into that category neatly enough. But from the beginning, there were details that didn't sit right. Ray's boots were clean, not spotless, but clean enough that he clearly hadn't walked through the thick brush surrounding the road. His clothes showed no tearing, no dirt ground into the fabric. There was no sign of a struggle in the leaves or soil. He hadn't been chased. He hadn't fought. It looked less like a crime of opportunity and more like an ending that had been decided somewhere else. Even stranger was the truck. Ray's personal pickup, a late-model Ford, was found 2 days later, parked legally at a truck stop nearly 40 miles away. Locked. No forced entry. No blood. No sign anyone else had been inside. Whatever brought Ray into the woods that night hadn't involved his own vehicle. Deputies filed their reports and sent the case to the county sheriff's office. With no witnesses, no suspects, and no obvious motive beyond robbery, the investigation slowed almost immediately. Ray's death was logged as an isolated homicide, pending further evidence. At home, his family struggled to understand how a man so cautious could end up alone in the forest at night. Ray had been methodical. He kept schedules. He checked in. If a shipment was delayed, he called ahead. When he didn't come home, it wasn't like him. And the idea that he'd simply wandered into the woods and been killed randomly never fully made sense to the people who knew him best. Less than 3 weeks later, another body was found. This time, it was farther east, near a disused logging spur outside a different county's jurisdiction. The man was Earl Whitman, 41 years old, a warehouse supervisor, with a history of contract work and freight distribution. He had been missing for 4 days. His body was discovered face down, partially concealed by leaves, but not buried. The cause of death was gunshot wounds. Again, 2 to the torso, 1 to the head. Local authorities treated it as a separate incident. Different county, different circumstances. Whitman's vehicle was located closer to the scene, abandoned along a gravel shoulder. No signs of forced entry. No wallet. No weapon. The similarities were noted quietly, mostly in side conversations. They weren't enough officially to link the cases. Missouri's rural law enforcement agencies were stretched thin. Each county operated with limited resources, and information sharing was slow, informal, and inconsistent. Without a clear connection, The deaths remained compartmentalized, each one handled in isolation. Families began asking questions that no one could answer. Why were these men being found in places they had no reason to be? Why did none of them appear to have resisted? Why did the violence feel so deliberate? The third body forced those questions closer to the surface. Luis Moreno was 29 years old, younger than the others. He worked short-term logistics contracts, often filling in where labor shortages existed. He disappeared after finishing a late shift at a distribution yard outside Springfield. His body was found 2 weeks later, deep in wooded land that bordered federal property. Once again, the same pattern. Execution-style gunshots. No wallet, no weapon, no evidence of a fight. Thibault. Medical examiner noted consistency in wound placement that suggested familiarity with firearms, possibly even training. But without a suspect or a known connection between the victims, the observation went no further. 3 men, 3 different counties, 3 scenes that felt both separate and eerily similar. At this point, the deaths were still not publicly connected. Press coverage was minimal, limited to short articles buried deep in local papers. The official stance remained unchanged. Tragic coincidences, unrelated crimes, no indication of a broader threat. Behind the scenes, confusion ruled. Jurisdictional boundaries created blind spots. One sheriff's department didn't have access to another's reports unless they specifically requested them. Evidence was logged locally, not centrally. There was no unified database tying together missing persons with violent crime across counties. Investigators worked their own pieces of the puzzle, unaware that others were holding matching fragments. For the families, the silence was unbearable. Ray Keller's relatives pressed for updates and were told there were none. Earl Whitman's wife was informed that without witnesses, progress would be slow. Luis Moreno's parents were left navigating a system that couldn't even tell them which agency was technically responsible. What bound the victims together wasn't obvious yet. They didn't socialize together. They didn't live in the same towns. They didn't share criminal records. To the outside world, they were ordinary working men whose paths crossed the freight and logistics industry in passing. But that industry itself rarely left a paper trail that was easy to follow. Short-term contracts, cash payments, subcontractors layered beneath subcontractors, work that moved quickly and disappeared just as fast. By the end of 1987, law enforcement believed the worst had passed. 3 murders, yes, but nothing to suggest a continuing threat. Patrols returned to normal. Investigators shifted focus to more immediate cases with solvable leads. What no one could see yet was that these deaths weren't the beginning of chaos. They were the beginning of order, a system operating quietly, efficiently, and with purpose. And somewhere in Missouri's backcountry, whatever had brought Ray Keller into the timber that night was still unfinished. By the summer of 1988, the silence around the earlier deaths no longer felt accidental. It felt deliberate, shaped by habit and exhaustion, and a system that had learned how to look away when answers didn't arrive quickly. 5 men were dead now. 5 bodies scattered across Missouri's backcountry, each one filed into a different drawer, each one treated as its own tragedy, with no obligation to explain the others. The 4th was found in May, just outside a narrow service road once used by conservation officers decades earlier. His name was Harold Hal Jensen, and 46. He worked intermittent contracts as a freight security consultant, mostly night runs, mostly short notice. He had been missing for 3 days. When his body was discovered, the scene felt familiar in a way that unsettled even seasoned deputies. No wallet, no weapon, no evidence of a fight. 3 gunshot wounds, placed with the same economy seen before. The 5th came less than 6 weeks later. Dennis Rowe, 38, warehouse inventory specialist. His body was located near a derelict bridge access point, another place most locals had forgotten existed. Same pattern. Same silence afterward. 5 deaths. 5 different counties. 5 investigations that never officially spoke to each other. Behind closed doors, some officers had begun to notice the repetition. The same caliber ammunition appearing in autopsy reports. The same absence of defensive injuries. The same choice of locations. Old access roads, forgotten spurs. Places visible enough to be found eventually, but remote enough to delay discovery. But noticing and proving were not the same thing. Without a centralized directive, these observations stayed fragmented, living in notebooks and quiet conversations instead of official briefings. One of the few people who refused to let it go was Daniel Hargreave, an investigator with the Missouri State Highway Patrol. Hargreave had not been assigned to the cases. He came across them incidentally, while reviewing reports tied to rural transport incidents. What caught his attention wasn't the violence itself, but the precision. These were not chaotic killings. They were controlled, measured, efficient. Hargreave began compiling his own file, unofficial and unsupported. He requested copies of reports when he could, compared timelines, noted small overlaps. What emerged was not a neat pattern, but something close enough to unsettle him. Every victim, without exception, had passed through a distribution hub tied to Midwest freight routes in the months before their deaths. Not all at the same time, not all in the same role, but each had intersected, briefly, with the same logistical arteries that moved goods across state lines at night. Some of those intersections were minor, a temporary assignment, a single overnight shift, a rerouted delivery that never appeared on a long-term schedule. But they were there. Enough to suggest that the connection wasn't personal, it was transactional. When Hargreave raised his concerns internally, the response was cautious, almost dismissive. There was no established motive, no shared employer, no criminal histories that justified escalation. The official position remained unchanged. Coincidence amplified by geography. Missouri was large. The Ozarks were remote. Bad things happened in quiet places. Publicly, authorities pushed back harder as media attention began to grow. Local papers started printing side-by-side summaries. 5 men. Similar deaths. Rural Missouri. The word pattern appeared, more than once, followed quickly by official statements, urging restraint. There was no serial offender, they said, no evidence of coordination. Drawing conclusions would only cause unnecessary fear. For the families, that reassurance felt hollow. Ray Keller's relatives had been waiting nearly a year with no answers. Earl Whitman's widow began speaking openly about the similarities she'd noticed herself. Luis Moreno's parents asked why their son's case file referenced the same bullet caliber as others found miles away. They were told that ammunition types were common, that rural violence often looked alike, that grief made people see connections that weren't there. Behind the scenes, the system strained under its own weight. Records were incomplete. Freight documentation was inconsistent, often lost or never filed. Subcontracting blurred responsibility to the point that no single agency could say with confidence what had moved where or who had been responsible for it. One fool, Hargreave attempted to trace shipment logs connected to the victims' work histories. He ran into dead ends, missing manifests, companies that no longer existed, routes that had been rerouted verbally and never recorded. It wasn't that the information didn't exist. It was that no one had ever expected to need it again. As months passed without arrests, frustration hardened into something quieter and more dangerous. Investigators began to doubt their instincts. Families learned how to live with unanswered questions. The cases cooled not because they were solved, but because there was nowhere obvious left to look. Hargreave kept working anyway. He mapped locations, distances, timelines. He noted how the bodies had been positioned, not hidden, not displayed, but placed, as if the killers expected them to be found, just not immediately, as if time itself was part of the method. The realization came slowly, and then all at once. These men hadn't been targeted for their identities, their personal lives, or even their jobs in the conventional sense. They had been selected because of proximity, because at some point they had been close to something that didn't belong to them, something valuable enough to kill for, and dangerous enough that leaving witnesses alive was not an option. What that something was remained unclear. There were no recovered items, no stolen vehicles, no missing weapons reported in connection with the deaths, just an absence that grew heavier with each new file. By late 1988, the question was no longer whether the deaths were connected. It was why the connection had been allowed to remain invisible for so long, and what else might still be out there, unfinished, waiting for the next man to cross a path he didn't know existed. The first real breakthrough didn't arrive with urgency or celebration. It surfaced quietly, almost by accident, buried inside a routine audit that most people never would have read all the way through. It was early 1989 when a freight compliance officer flagged a discrepancy tied to a shipment from August of 1987. The note was brief, a line item that never closed. Cargo listed as delivered, but never confirmed. Payment issued, but no receiving signature logged. On paper, it was ordinary enough to be ignored. Industrial machinery. High value, yes, but not unusual for Midwest freight corridors. What made it stand out was how completely the trail ended. No follow-up documentation, no damage reports, no theft claim. The shipment had simply vanished. When Daniel Hargreave saw the entry, it stopped him. The date matched too closely. August 1987 was weeks before Raymond Keller was found dead in the Ozarks, before the pattern had even begun to take shape. Hargreave requested the full file and immediately ran into resistance. The company listed as the primary contractor no longer existed. Its offices were empty, its phone numbers disconnected. Its records, supposedly archived, could not be located. What little remained told an incomplete story. The shipment originated out of state, routed through Missouri as part of a longer chain. It changed hands more than once, passed between subcontractors whose names appeared nowhere else. Independent drivers were paid in cash. Temporary escorts were assigned without standard background checks. Every safeguard that should have slowed the process was missing. As investigators dug deeper, the paperwork began to contradict itself. Manifests didn't match weights. Delivery times overlapped impossibly. Some signatures appeared identical across different forms, as if copied. Others were missing entirely. It wasn't sloppy work. It was deliberate misdirection. Slowly, the names began to surface. Ray Keller's employee ID appeared in a secondary log, not as the primary escort, but as a relief assignment. He'd been brought in for a single overnight stretch. Earl Whitman had approved inventory staging at a warehouse the shipment passed through, though he never signed off on its contents. Luis Moreno worked a temporary shift, loading sealed crates he was told not to open. By mid-1989, investigators could confirm that at least 7 of the men who would eventually be murdered had crossed paths with the same shipment. Some only briefly. Some without ever knowing what they were handling. Others began to suspect something was wrong, but lacked the authority or the time to stop it. At the time, stolen cargo wasn't a priority. Nationally, the late 1980s saw law enforcement resources stretched thin by drug trafficking, violent crime spikes, and emerging federal initiatives that pushed freight theft into the background. Unless a company filed a formal claim, shipments that disappeared were often written off as losses absorbed by insurance. Few were investigated deeply. Fewer still were connected to violent crime. That environment created space. Organized groups understood it well. Freight moved faster than oversight. Paper trails could be bent, erased, or rerouted. If a shipment changed hands often enough, responsibility dissolved. Witness interviews painted a troubling picture. One warehouse clerk recalled being told to ignore mismatched crate numbers. A dispatcher remembered being pressured to reroute a delivery verbally without updating the system. An independent driver admitted he was paid double to keep quiet and drive a route he'd never been assigned before. Some of the victims seemed to realize too late that they were standing too close to something dangerous. Earl Whitman had reportedly asked questions in the days before his death. He'd called a colleague, uneasy about discrepancies he couldn't reconcile. Raymond Keller mentioned to a family member that a recent escort job felt wrong, though he never explained why. Luis Moreno told a coworker that sealed crates weren't supposed to hum when they were loaded. None of them had enough information to understand the full picture. They only knew that something was off. As investigators layered these fragments together, the theory shifted. This wasn't a single theft gone wrong. It wasn't opportunistic. It was systematic. The shipment hadn't been stolen once. It had been intercepted, redirected, fragmented, passed along through shadow routes that allowed parts of it to disappear without drawing attention. And after each interception, the circle of people who knew even a piece of the truth grew larger. That was the danger. Killing one man might erase one witness. Killing several ensured that no one left alive could reconstruct the route. Each death severed another link. Each body found in the woods marked the end of a question that would never be asked again. By the end of 1989, investigators were forced to confront the scale of what they were facing. This wasn't random violence hidden by coincidence. It was controlled elimination tied to logistics, timing, and silence. The Ozarks weren't just convenient dumping grounds. They were neutral territory, distant from scrutiny, where jurisdiction blurred and time worked in favor of whoever wanted the truth buried. The most disturbing realization came last. The shipment's contents were still unaccounted for. Whatever had vanished in August of 1987 was never recovered, never seized, never officially reported stolen. It was still out there, dispersed, protected by the very absence of records meant to track it. And if men had been killed to erase its trail once, there was no reason to believe the killing was finished. By the start of 1990, denial was no longer an option. Another body had been found, then another. Each discovery followed the same quiet pattern that had begun years earlier. Rural land, limited witnesses, no immediate answers. But this time, the accumulation of dead men could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. The number alone forced a reckoning. 6 more men would be killed over the next 2 years, bringing the total to 11. 11 separate lives ended in nearly identical ways, spread across the Ozarks like points on a map no one wanted to draw. The acknowledgement came slowly and reluctantly. Internal memos began using different language. Related incidents. Potential coordination. When the word series finally appeared in an official briefing, it carried the weight of years of missed chances. A multi-agency task force was formed, pulling together county sheriffs, the Missouri State Highway Patrol, and federal liaisons who had once dismissed stolen cargo as a low-level concern. The purpose was narrow, but urgent. Identify the pattern. Stop the killing. The first thing the task force did was lay the bodies out geographically. When plotted together, the locations revealed something unsettling. The victims weren't scattered randomly. They formed a loose corridor through the Ozark backcountry, clustered around abandoned service roads, decommissioned logging routes, and rarely used access points that cut through conservation land. These weren't places stumbled upon by chance. They were chosen. Survival experts were brought in to assess the terrain. They noted how each location balanced isolation with inevitability. Bodies were placed where scavenging would be limited, slowing decomposition, but where hikers, hunters, or maintenance crews would eventually pass through. The killers weren't trying to hide what they had done. They were controlling when it would be discovered. Time itself had become part of the method. Ballistics analysis confirmed what some investigators had suspected for years. The bullets recovered from the scenes shared distinctive markings, not necessarily the same firearm, but the same weapon family. Consistent rifling patterns, similar manufacturing batches. It suggested access to a controlled supply, not a random assortment of guns picked up over time. Behavioral analysts reviewed the case files and came to a sobering conclusion. The killings showed discipline, no unnecessary violence, no signatures meant to taunt law enforcement. Each victim was neutralized efficiently. The shooters knew how to move through rural terrain without leaving obvious traces. They understood how long it would take for a body to be found and how to minimize the risk of being seen. This was not amateur work. That level of control pointed investigators toward a specific profile. Men with training. Men comfortable with logistics and security. Men who knew freight routes and rural Missouri equally well. That was when a defunct name resurfaced. Midland Transfer Solutions had once operated quietly as a freight security subcontractor based in Missouri. On paper, it provided escorts and risk assessments for high-value shipments. In reality, it had functioned more like a clearinghouse, connecting former military personnel with short-term contract work that existed in regulatory gray areas. The company dissolved in the late 1980s, its closure barely noticed. But its personnel records told a different story. A small circle of former contractors stood out. Caleb Voss, Martin Reese, Jonah Pike. All three had combat backgrounds. All three had worked freight security assignments tied to Midwest routes. All three had financial activity that spiked during the period when the mysterious shipment disappeared. Investigators began building timelines. Voss had been present in Missouri during several of the murders, though never officially assigned nearby. Reese's name appeared on subcontractor rosters, connected to the vanished shipment. Pike had purchased rural property not far from two of the body recovery sites, paid for in cash. As scrutiny increased, the pressure shifted. Surveillance was authorized. Financial records were subpoenaed. Interviews were scheduled. And then, without warning, the pattern changed. Jonah Pike was reported dead in what authorities initially called a hunting accident. He was found alone on private land, a gunshot wound, consistent with an accidental discharge. There were no witnesses. The ruling came quickly, too quickly for some. Days later, investigators learned that Caleb Voss had disappeared. His residence was empty, his bank accounts inactive, his vehicle abandoned at a remote lot near the edge of the Ozarks. No sign of struggle. No note. No trace of where he'd gone. The timing was impossible to ignore. The task force faced a new and chilling possibility. The people responsible for the killings weren't just eliminating witnesses from the original shipment. They were now eliminating each other, cleaning up loose ends as law enforcement closed in. Martin Reese remained unaccounted for, his whereabouts uncertain. Surveillance teams worked around the clock, aware that every delay increased the risk that another body would surface. The Ozarks, once treated as a backdrop to unrelated crimes, had become something else entirely. A controlled kill zone shaped by familiarity, patience, and an understanding of how easily silence could be maintained. For the families of the victims, the renewed attention was both hope and agony. Years had passed without answers. Now, suddenly, there were names, faces, a suggestion of motive. But there was also the fear that justice might come too late, that the men responsible would vanish into the same wilderness they had used so effectively. By the end of 1992, the task force knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Whether through arrest or death, The truth was forcing its way closer to the surface. And somewhere in the Ozarks, someone was making decisions about who would be left alive to tell it. The break came quietly and almost didn't come at all. In early 1993, an out-of-state tip reached the task force through a federal intermediary. It wasn't framed as a confession. It was a request. A man wanted to talk, but only if protections were in place first. Only if his name stayed sealed until the last possible moment. He hadn't lived in Missouri for years, and he had no intention of returning unless he was certain he wouldn't leave in a body bag. His name was Thomas Elridge. He was 38 years old. In the late 1980s, he had worked as a freight dispatcher, the kind of job that sat just far enough from the physical cargo to feel safe. Paperwork, phone calls, route adjustments, nothing that looked dangerous on its face. That illusion had shattered in 1988. Elridge agreed to speak once federal protection was arranged. When investigators finally sat across from him, they understood immediately why he had waited so long. He didn't present like a man seeking attention. He was cautious, controlled, still afraid. He described being approached by subcontractors he didn't recognize, pressured to reroute shipments verbally, instructed not to log changes into the system. At first, he believed it was standard corner cutting, expediency. Then the pressure escalated. He told them about the night he witnessed a forced execution. It happened at a rural transfer point, far from any official terminal. He had been ordered to attend, under the pretense of verifying a reroute. Instead, he watched as a man he recognized from freight records was led away from a truck and shot without hesitation. No argument, no warning, just a decision carried out efficiently. Elridge fled Missouri within days, abandoning his job, his apartment, and any connection that could tie him back to that moment. For years, he lived quietly, convinced that disappearing was the only reason he was still alive. His testimony filled in the missing center of the case. The shipment that vanished in August of 1987 was no longer an abstract mystery. According to Elridge, it had contained illegal, military-grade firearms diverted from overseas surplus stock, weapons that were never meant to enter civilian circulation. The freight paperwork labeling it as industrial machinery had been a cover, thin but sufficient in a system that rarely looked twice. The men who died weren't targets of opportunity. They were risks. Some knew too much. Some asked the wrong questions. Some were simply present at the wrong moment, close enough to identify faces or routes. Eliminating them wasn't emotional. It was procedural. Once Elridge's account was corroborated against existing evidence, the case moved into a different phase. Federal agencies stepped in without public announcement. Surveillance intensified. Financial records were examined with new urgency. What emerged was a laundering operation hidden in plain sight. Rural land purchases made in cash, properties that sat empty, but changed hands repeatedly. Money flowing through shell companies that dissolved before taxes were due. Arrests followed, quiet and methodical. Peripheral players first. Drivers, brokers, men who had facilitated movement without pulling triggers. Each arrest tightened the circle, confirming pieces of Elridge's account. The operational chain was real, structured, designed to survive scrutiny by dissolving into fragments when pressed. One name remained absent: Caleb Voss. Despite warrants and surveillance alerts, Voss was nowhere to be found. His known associates were either dead or in custody. His financial trail went cold. The backcountry he knew so well offered endless places to disappear, and investigators were forced to consider that he might succeed. Then came the discovery that tied everything together. In late 1993, during a targeted search of land connected to one of the laundering properties, investigators uncovered a shallow grave. Inside were remains, but more importantly, sealed containers buried alongside them. Weapons, ammunition, documentation, enough physical evidence to link every murder, every reroute, every missing man to a single operational chain that began and ended with the vanished shipment. It was proof, finally, that the killings were not isolated acts of violence, but steps in a calculated process. And it left one question unanswered: whether Caleb Voss was still out there, watching the net close, or whether he had already chosen his own ending somewhere deep in the Missouri backcountry. The call came in during the first week of March 1995. 2 hikers had reported human remains in a steep ravine deep inside Missouri's backcountry, an area rarely visited except by hunters who knew the land well enough to avoid it. The terrain was unforgiving: narrow paths, loose rock, a place where mistakes could be fatal and where few people ever lingered long enough to be noticed. When investigators reached the site, they already understood the significance. The location sat inside the same geographic corridor that had defined the killings for nearly 8 years. It was remote, but not accidental. The body lay partially concealed by erosion and fallen debris, exposed slowly over time. There was no sign of disturbance by animals beyond what was expected. Nearby, investigators found a handgun, spent casing still close enough to suggest it had not been moved. Dental records confirmed the identity within hours: Caleb Voss. He had been dead for some time. The medical examiner determined the cause of death was a self-inflicted gunshot wound. There were no signs of struggle, no defensive injuries, no evidence that anyone else had been present when it happened. Voss had chosen the place carefully. Somewhere he knew well. Somewhere he had once controlled. What changed everything was what was found nearby. Buried under loose soil and rock were sealed containers, protected against moisture. Inside them were weapons, ammunition, and documents. The final inventory list investigators had been searching for since 1987. Every serial number matched what had disappeared years earlier. The list was complete, not partial, not reconstructed. It was the original operational record, preserved with care. The shipment was no longer a theory. It was real, tangible, final. With that discovery, the last uncertainty collapsed. Voss had not been running forever. He had been managing an ending, keeping control until the moment he decided it was no longer possible. When the walls closed in, he didn't leave a confession. He left proof. The case moved quickly after that. Prosecutors prepared public statements. For the first time, the full scope of the conspiracy was outlined openly. Illegal military-grade firearms diverted from overseas surplus, routed through shell companies, protected by falsified freight records, enforced through calculated violence. 11 men eliminated not because they were enemies, but because they were liabilities. The families heard the truth together, some of them for the first time. They learned why their loved ones had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Why the killings had been so controlled. Why years had passed without answers. There was no comfort in it, but there was clarity. Their sons, husbands, brothers had not been forgotten. They had been silenced. The official closure came soon after. Files were stamped, task forces disbanded. The Missouri backcountry slayings were no longer listed as unsolved. On paper, the system had worked. Eventually. But there was no sense of victory, no celebration. Only a quiet reckoning with what had been missed. How easily the early deaths had been dismissed. How long jurisdictional confusion had delayed recognition. How stolen cargo, treated as a financial inconvenience, had masked something far more dangerous. 11 men had died to protect a shipment that was never supposed to exist. A shipment that moved freely because no one was looking closely enough. A shipment that disappeared not once, but piece by piece, under the cover of routine. The Ozarks returned to silence, trails reclaimed by time, Roads faded further into memory. But the case left a mark on everyone who touched it. Investigators who carried the weight of years lost. Families who learned that answers do not heal. They only settle the question of why. Caleb Voss was the last man found, but he was not the last consequence. The cost of that silence stretched far beyond 1995, into every place where oversight failed and violence learned how to hide in plain sight.